So as Theresa just said, we're going to be giving a very, very, very broad overview of the dyslexia guidelines because they're pretty detailed. But let's just talk a little bit about how they came to be a little bit more in detail. So the guidelines were written in consultation with the dyslexia work group, and that work group met over the course of a year. I think about seven work sessions, and that work group their task was to assist CDE in developing these guidelines for school staff and for parents and for other educators to help them support students with dyslexia. And that work group was made up of parents, general educators, special educators, medical professionals, other educational professionals that are involved in supporting students with dyslexia. So we always, at the beginning of every one of those work sessions, the person who coordinated those sessions presented this message because it's important. The guidelines themselves are not laws. They're not ed code. They're not mandates on on districts or on schools. They're exemplary in nature, and so it's just important for all the stakeholders to understand that. And the guidelines are currently with CDE Press. They're just wrapping up their editing and layout process, and they'll be published on the CDE website in August.
What Richard and I are going to do next is talk a little bit about our background and experience to give you some context of why we're here. But again, I like to call this an interactive presentation, and so I like to start with this question. What would happen if every student in your community, your district, your school, your classroom, and I have to share, my lens is a classroom teacher. I've been a classroom teacher and a school administrator. What would happen if every one of those students was reading at or above grade level? And what I'd like you to do, I know, I know, happy dance, right? Talk to somebody, and then we're gonna do a little bit of share out. I'll give you 1 minute and 13 seconds. How's that? Go. Okay, I gave you 1 minute and 15 seconds. So, anybody want to share out? Anybody willing to share? And there is a wireless mic somewhere. What would happen? What would it look like if every student could read at or above grade level? What would we see? What would we see at home? Somebody's willing to share. Thank you.
It would not just impact the reading, but it would impact their math and every other aspect of their scholastic career.
Thank you. If you couldn't hear, she said it would impact their math and every other score. Is that what you said? Someone else willing to share with the microphone? I think there's one up here.
There would be less tears every day. There would be better self-esteem every day, especially in middle school. It's a rough time for kids anyway. And they would have the belief that they could actually do anything they wanted.
Are you talking about student tears? What? Mom tears? Dad tears? Teacher tears? Do teachers ever cry over their students? Okay. One more person willing to share.
More kids would graduate from high school and less children would go to prison.
Excellent. So now I'm going to give you another question. What would have to happen? What would need to change? What kind of what type of adult behaviors would need to change in order to make it so that every student read at or above grade level? That's a more complicated question because it's about adults, so I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Go. Okay, somebody up here said that was too long of a list, but what would have to change in your classroom? What adult behaviors would have to change in your classroom, your school, your district, your community, workplace even, community-based organizations, to make that happen? Anybody brave enough to share?
I think everybody would have to believe that every kid can learn how to read, first of all.
So the other thing is, I think it's really important that teachers and districts understand that a lot of children are not going to read in the typical manner and get training on how to teach children with specific learning disabilities. I personally believe that all children should be taught as if they have dyslexia. There's no harm for typical children. They're going to learn how to read. And that way you're catching them right from the beginning, and we're not waiting until like 2nd or 3rd grade until we see that there's a problem, which is way too late. So I've actually set that up in my district to get some of the teachers trained at our local dyslexia center, and it's not even expensive. So that's, okay.
Thank you. We've got someone in the back that's willing to share.
The implementation of technology, stuff like text to speech, speech to text, and getting it to read math and sciences and abbreviations correctly. Once that is in place, I think it will be something that everybody would use, but right now it's kind of hit and miss.
And stop calling assistive technology cheating, right? Up here, we've got somebody up here.
So I'm an occupational therapist, and I've just recently started looking into dyslexia more because I see a lot of it. And what I'd like to do, I've been reading a little bit on some of the research, and so I'd love to learn more what kinds of guidelines you have. And I want to incorporate it into the handwriting piece, because the OT goes there for the letters, right? And that's where we see this breakdown usually. Why not bring in phonemic awareness and other things that can be very helpful? I also think the occupational therapist could be very helpful in encouraging PowerPoints and other kinds of representation for the child in this world of technology in their sessions to help them express themselves until the reading comes online.
Great, thank you. Before I forget, Patty asked me to remind you, we will have note cards to hand out for questions at the end, so she can hand those out. There was one more comment up here. Kelly, can you get that?
This kind of piggybacks on what this lady said, but early intervention, not waiting until they're in 2nd or 3rd grade, which is what happens often in our schools. And then small group intervention. We're talking about how each kid needs to learn they learn differently, and yet we put 25, 30 kids in a classroom and expect the teacher to teach all 30 kids 25 different ways.
So if you leave with nothing else today but this thought, what would need to change about adult behaviors so that all students could be reading at or above grade level? That's a win for us, okay? I see we've got a couple of more questions. If you want to just put those on the note cards? So I'm going to just tell a tiny bit about my story, my background. Richard will share his, and then we'll get into the meat of the guidelines and some of the recommendations moving forward. So my story is, I live in a now very, very famous town in a very, very famous county in rural Northern California. I live in Orville. Who knows where Orville is? Okay. Who knew where Orville was before February? Yeah, okay, all right. So the good news is I live above water level, so I did not have to evacuate during the flood. However, 2 weeks ago, I was right in the middle of the fire and had to evacuate for the fire, which burned up to my mailbox. So a little bit scary in Butte County. I tell you that to let you know that my context is rural Northern California. I've worked in Butte, Sutter, and Glenn counties. Tiny districts, very rural, primarily middle school teacher, high school, middle school, and elementary administration. Did a little stint at Butte College, and now I'm at the State Department. So it's an odd little trajectory. Still live in Orville, Commute to Sacramento every day. I'm committed, right? You should let my boss know that, okay? When I came to Sacramento, my job was to monitor school districts for compliance in special ed. So I kind of figured I'd get districts like what I was familiar with. No, I got Los Angeles Unified, Los Angeles County Office of Education, Pomona, Pasadena, and the West San Gabriel Valley SELPA. Thankfully, those districts are very patient with me because my background's not special ed, and I had no context for large urban districts. They taught me a lot. Currently, I'm the administrator, as Patty shared, of the policy unit, and we call ourselves kind of the Mikey of the special ed division or the miscellaneous unit, because every project that nobody knows what to do, they say, hey, that seems like it belongs in Theresa's unit. Let's give that to her. So that's what I'm doing now at the State Department. I will share with you that in my preparation as a teacher, I had no background, no training, no instruction, and no coursework in how to teach students who were I didn't have any training in how to teach reading, period, okay? And they knew, and I went to good universities, they knew I was going to get a multiple subjects and a single subject credential, no training in reading instruction. I assumed, wrongfully, that at middle school, all students would know how to read. So one of the stories I asked about, do teachers ever cry? One of the most poignant stories in my career is I was reading students. I used to do a lot with young literature, like children's literature. And I had a Dr. Seuss book on my desk, and a student came up to me and he says, Miss Johansen, he said, I can't read that book. And I wish I could remember his name. I think it was Philip. But I said, Philip, what do you mean you can't read this book? This book is Hop on Pop. And he said, I can't read that book, Miss Johansen. But then he said, but it don't matter, because my daddy's in jail, and my uncles are in jail, and I'll probably be in jail too. That broke my heart. From there, I moved into high school administration. Had a student walk into my office one day and say, Miss Johansen, I can't read. And I said, Tucker, you're a junior in high school. What do you mean you can't read? And he said, well, it's not that I can't read. It's just that I start at the top of the page of the history book. And when I get to the bottom of the page, I can't remember what was at the top of the page. And that truly is where I started my journey as an administrator. I was a high school principal who needed to understand how I could have a junior in high school that didn't know how to read. Simultaneously, I had a little boy. So I have 3 children, 2 girls. I believe my girls were born reading because I truly do not remember when they didn't talk and when they didn't read and when they didn't write. My oldest one, I used to give her books to make her be quiet because when she was reading, she would leave mommy alone. And then I got my little boy. My little boy struggled so much in school, behaviorally and academic, that when he was in the 8th grade, he was going to be expelled. And it was at that point I sought external help to try and address his learning needs. Now the good news is he just graduated from high school and he's going to college. But that was a journey, that was a struggle that I could have done without. It taught us a lot, but it was painful. So I come to this topic professionally and personally, and I understand why it brings tears to your eyes as a parent, why it brings tears to your eyes as an educator. Richard.
So I started my career in special education over 20 years ago as a one-to-one aide at the Kennedy Krieger Institute in Baltimore. And at the time, I was going through my master's program at Johns Hopkins, my master's program in teaching. And Kennedy Krieger it's a level 5 non-public school or facility in Baltimore. And after I finished my master's program, I was hired by Kennedy Krieger to be the English teacher in the middle school there. And so I show up to teach my middle school students. And what I quickly realized is that what these students didn't need was conventional English language instruction, ELA instruction. They needed to learn how to read. My middle school students were reading anywhere from non-readers to the 3rd grade level, and I was totally unprepared to teach them. So I did my research. Luckily, a lot of research was coming out at that time on what were effective programs for teaching this population to read. And so I identified a program. In my case, it was Wilson Language Training. I got the training on how to implement it, and I started using it in my classroom. I found it to be very effective. So then I started working with the Institute as a whole to have that program implemented institute-wide. During this time, Kennedy Krieger was contracted by Baltimore City Public Schools to coordinate special education services in several of the local elementary schools, and they asked me to coordinate the reading component of that program, and so I worked with those schools to put in place effective reading instruction for the students at the elementary level in those classes. As a part of that project, I was exposed to the core reading curriculum in those schools was the Success for All reading program, and I saw that was a really well-developed, well-structured reading program, and I ended up going to work for Success for All for a number of years as a reading curriculum developer and a developer of reading technology. So that's kind of how I come to this place now. We ultimately moved to California, and I came to work at CDE to help support the dyslexia guidelines. So what you're looking at is the table of contents for the dyslexia guidelines. You can see some of the topics that are covered are the definition of dyslexia and how it's handled in California Education Code, what scientific research has to say about the neurobiology of people with dyslexia, the characteristics of students with dyslexia, and the effective instructional approaches for students with dyslexia. Both the definition of dyslexia that is included within the guidelines, which is the International Dyslexia Association's definition of dyslexia, and California Ed Code points to the phonological processing deficits that students with dyslexia have. And so I just want to talk a little bit about what that is, what that means. So phonological processing, it's the interrelationship of phonological awareness, of phonological memory, and of rapid naming. And you can see phonological awareness, that's that understanding that language can be divided into smaller units. Phonemes, words, syllables, it's that not everybody has that awareness. Not everybody can make those distinctions. And then underneath the umbrella of phonological awareness is phonemic awareness. And that's the ability to identify and to manipulate those individual and discrete sounds of language. And then the other two components of phonological processing are phonological memory, and that is short-term memory of sounds. So, for instance, if I heard a telephone number and I had to go and walk over to the telephone and dial that number, a few seconds later, that would be an example of phonological memory. And rapid naming is the retrieval of long-term phonological memory. So an example of rapid naming is being able to quickly say colors as you see them, or to say letter names as you see the letters. That's examples of rapid naming. All of those things work together within phonological processing.
So Emily's going to cover like the next 3 slides. So we're going to skip to sort of that notion of intervention at the school or district level, and how would you start to structure that kind of a program? So again, audience involvement. How many of you have heard of something called MTSS, or multi-tiered system of support? Anybody down in Orange County this last week at the SUMS? Nobody? Okay. We were down there all week. So what we're going to talk about is, if you were, for example, if I was the principal or I was the superintendent and somebody said, you need to figure out how to implement these guidelines and address the needs of struggling readers, what would you do? So it's what you call a tiered intervention model, where you look at what kind of reading instruction is every student going to receive? What kind of reading instruction are some students going to receive? And what kind of reading instruction and support or intervention are just a few students, those students really struggling and likely to have dyslexia, what would they receive?
So the guidelines encourage districts to establish a multi-tiered systems of support for all of their students from pre-K up through high school. But what the message we're trying to get across is that when districts are establishing establishing their MTSS system, we strongly encourage them to put a focus on early intervention, as someone said before, that what research has shown is that when you catch the students early, when you catch them pre-K, first grade, the intervention is much more effective than trying to remediate it later on. When you catch them that early, you're really taking advantage of the child's brain plasticity, and it's much more effective. So we strongly encourage that focus on early intervention.
When you start thinking about who should be on your team as you're planning, and special note, MTSS is not limited to reading. It can be interventions for students who are struggling with behavior. If you've heard of PBIS, PBIS is a form of a multi-tiered system of support for students that are struggling with behavior. Just think of this in terms of students struggling academically with math or English language arts reading or social emotional skills. So it's good to have your administrator support, your special education staff, your reading specialists, resource specialists, general education staff, speech language pathologists. Somebody mentioned like your service providers, so your OTs, your PTs, school psychologists. I know I'm missing people. I was talking to an individual today and asking about her background, and she said she was a program specialist, but she's from another state, and she has a reading specialist credential. And I said, get ready, because you're going to be very busy. So start thinking about who should be on your team. I guess this one's mine too. And then start thinking about what kind of tools would you use in that tier 1. So what is your straight K1, 2 English language arts curriculum look like, your reading literacy program? What would you use for that tier 2, that middle tier? And what would you use for those few students who really do have dyslexia? And it's not just, students can struggle with comprehension, but it's not necessarily dyslexia. What are you going to do for those in that top tier? And when you kind of break it down, there isn't a lot that's out there in the universe that's going to work for that top tier, and that's some of what Emily will talk about later. Start thinking about screening tools. What kind of assessments will you use? What kind of evidence-based reading programs? Is there software out there that you can use? And maybe there's other programs. What I find oftentimes, if schools have really good reading intervention programs in the closet, like they got them once, they used them, they put them away because something else came along, and they're there, they're just not using them.
And the guidelines themselves and the department as a whole just wants to emphasize that when you're when you are choosing these interventions for students with dyslexia or all struggling readers, there's certain criteria that really those interventions should meet. And those criteria are they need to be evidence-based, multisensory, direct, explicit, structured, and sequential. And they need to teach phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. The interventions need to meet all of those criteria. So when you're evaluating as a district, what is it that we're going to put in place, you need to be thinking in those terms.
You have our contact information at the back as well as a big list of resources. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, thank you. We certainly appreciate folks showing up for the last session. We know sometimes it's hard to stick in the whole day, and this is sort of the end of the end. When I was asked to give this talk today, I was asked to talk about sort of the current state of research in dyslexia and struggling readers, and then also talk about what are the effective intervention practices that we know about. I'm an associate professor here in the School of Education. I'm also an affiliate faculty at the Mind Institute, and I direct the UC Davis Reading and Academic Development Center, and that's on campus. It's just I don't know, a quarter of a mile from here. I walked over here today. And in our center, what we do is we have a few large federally funded grants where we're engaged in empirical research about reading for all different types of populations of kids. We also provide a clinic for the community. So we provide intervention services for kids. Parents come in and we provide services on a sliding scale fee basis, so dependent upon income, because our goal is to really provide services to everybody who needs them in the community. And then we also do community outreach. We do in-service and professional development for local schools and districts. So that's what we do there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the population of kids who are struggling in our schools with reading. Oftentimes I'm asked sort of, well, why are we so concerned about this group of kids? And one of the things is that it's a pretty big group of kids. It's about 20 to 25% of kids in schools struggle in reading development, in some aspects of reading development. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we sort of break those things up, because kids can struggle with one part of reading and not another, and you want to make sure that you're intervening in the right areas. We also know that kids who struggle with reading tend to struggle across their lifespan. So if a kid is struggling at the end of first grade, there's almost a 90% chance of them remaining a poor reader across their lifespan. And so what does that really mean? It doesn't mean that these kids can't learn how to read. But it does mean that it's probably going to be a lifelong difficulty for them in some way, shape, or form. It's never going to be as fluent as a process for a kid who doesn't struggle to learn how to read. We also know, as was said earlier, is early intervention is very, very important. The NICHG has shown that it takes 4 times as long to intervene with a 4th grader as it does a late kindergarten or 1st grade. And having worked in the schools and currently working with schools, I really see this as a resource issue. If we are going to wait until 3rd and 4th grade to intervene with kids, we are going to be spending way too many resources doing that. So we really need to come up with models that can catch kids in kindergarten and 1st grade who are struggling for reading. And part of my research is really looking at that piece. We also know, through empirical research and well-designed studies, that we do a pretty good job teaching kids how to decode and how to read. So if you intervene in the right way, in a controlled setting with explicit instruction, about 70 to 90% of kids can learn to decode in the average range. So we know how to do this. The difficulty becomes when we start to implement this stuff in school settings. Because all of us know that there are a lot of things going on in schools, and there are a lot of demands on our teachers' time. And so it's easier to do in a clinical setting, right? And a part of my research agenda is sort of developing interventions that are feasible for teachers to use. So some of the objectives today is that I'm going to talk about profiles of struggling readers. So what do these kids look like? And what does the current research tell us? I'm going to talk about how reading difficulties are brain-based and evidence-based instruction. So first, on profiles of struggling readers. When we look at the literature, we really see two different types of struggling readers. The first type is developmental dyslexia, which was spoken about a little bit earlier, and it really is a phonological processing difficulty. There's a lot of sort of myths out there about what dyslexia is. It's not that, kids see letters backwards on a page. It really is a sound difficulty, so phonological processing, so the processing of sounds. And then we also know there's another group of kids that are called poor comprehenders. And those of you who have worked with kids in schools, I'm sure have seen kids who read very fluently, and they have no idea what they've read. They don't comprehend what they've read. So we know that these two different types of difficulties, they can occur alone or they can occur together, right? So when I talk about developing targeted interventions, you really need to know where kids are struggling in their reading before you start implementing an intervention. Because if you have a kid who's a poor comprehender, you don't want to be wasting your time doing a decoding intervention, right? It's another resource issue. So to break this down just a little bit more and to give you some more of idea of the profiles here, kids who have dyslexia, we don't have a pointer, do we? No. That's okay. Kids who have dyslexia tend to have poor word recognition skills, but typically have really good language comprehension. So their oral language is average or better than average. Kids who we call hyperlexic or poor comprehenders tend to have good word recognition, but poor language comprehension. And then we have our kids who have both these things. So they have difficulties with the decoding and also comprehension, and they have this unfortunate name of being called the garden variety poor readers. And then we have good readers that have good language comprehension and good word recognition skills. And of course, this can be broken down even more, which I will do. So developmental dyslexia is a domain-specific process rather than it's operating across multiple domains. And it's a phonological core hypothesis that poor readers have incomplete representations of words and their sounds or their phonemes in their long-term memory. And if you sort of think about that for a second, if you have a difficult time sounding out words orally, then you're going to have a really hard time connecting that to the letters on a page and making words and reading words fluently, right? So that's really where the deficit is. That is something that is teachable, though, which is good news. I talked about this briefly, so we do see some dyslexia myths. I still have teachers that will ask me. I actually will get very random emails from teachers in the field about dyslexia and say, I have this student who sees letters backwards. They must be dyslexic. Or the other thing I get is, I have a kid who's a second grader who writes their letters backwards. Do you think they're dyslexic? So this is a sort of common myth in the field. And actually, I think some parents are sort of confused by this too, because we do still see this, right? Another myth is that children will outgrow their reading problems. As I said before, some of these skills are teachable, but it will, for most kids, be a lifelong struggle. And we also know that kids with dyslexia are really, really smart, right? They have strengths. I always get a little bit discouraged because we talk a lot about their weaknesses and their deficits. But kids with dyslexia are very smart, and they have other strengths that some other people don't have. So the poor comprehenders is a different group of kids. It's been much less studied. Sometimes they're referred to the late emerging reading disabled. And if you read empirical literature on kids with reading, you will know them as the LERD group, which I think is another unfortunate name for a group of kids. So they typically have normal phonological processing. They're fluent readers, so they can read, but they don't understand what they're reading. I sort of argue in my work that I don't think that these kids in 3rd and 4th grade just all of a sudden have a reading comprehension difficulty. I think one of the issues is we just don't know how to assess for this when kids are younger. We are pretty good, actually we're very good at assessing phonological awareness. We're very good at assessing decoding. We're good at assessing fluency. We are not good at all at assessing comprehension difficulties, and especially before kids can read, right? Because you would have to do that through an oral assessment. These kids typically have difficulties with receptive vocabulary and with spoken discourse from a young age. So when we're looking at identifying kids who might have later developing reading comprehension difficulties, we're screening them in first grade on things like listening comprehension and vocabulary. So skilled reading comprehension is made up of a lot of different things. And if we sort of bought into the National Reading Panel and the early reading first sort of look at, well, really it was the early reading first sort of stuff, we really hit hard on the phonological processing and alphabet knowledge and reading fluency in the early grades. And we sort of expected kids to just all of a sudden comprehend what they're reading. And I don't think that's the way that it works. I think if you've worked with any child, you know that you have to also be teaching the comprehension strategies. So I have a little bit of a different view on this, that there's a whole bunch of other things going on, including oral language and vocabulary, very, very important for comprehension, knowledge of syntax. There's working memory and executive control, so there's lots of processing going on during reading. It's a very complex task. Reading is very complex. And then the other thing is listening and language comprehension. So the question for me really is can we take kids who appear to be struggling in both decoding and comprehension in the early grades and create interventions that address listening comprehension or language comprehension, whatever you want to call it, and also decoding at the same time? And then, of course, in the state of California, we have many children who do not speak English as their first language, and so we have to take into account that these kids have these languages, these other listening comprehension and vocabulary and syntax and stuff that's sort of feeding into this comprehension. Another way to think about this is the famous Scarborough sort of model of this, that all of these skills that I've talked about are really important and they grow together over time, right? So there's independent skills that weave together over time in order to become a skilled reader. And when I talk about reading being very complex, this is what I'm talking about. There's so much stuff happening at once that you have to really know. If you have a struggling reader in front of you, you have to be able to figure out, well, why are they struggling with reading? Because it can be so many different things. So, what does the research show? So, the research has recently shown, well, sort of in the last 20 years, that reading difficulties are brain-based. And I'm going to go into each of these a little bit more in depth here in just a second. That intervention can be effective. I'm going to show you some growth trajectories of reading of kids who get intervention and those who do not. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of where the field has converged on which interventions practices are the most effective. So this is the brain. We do know that we do know now in the last 20 years, so the literature sort of shown that, that reading disabilities and dyslexia are brain-based. And I'm going to show you some comparisons of brains here. So on the top, you have a normal reader, and that's the right hemisphere and left hemisphere of a normal reader across the top there. On the bottom, you have a child who's having difficulties with reading. And so what are the differences that you see as far as brain activation goes? Yeah. So in the struggling reader, there's a lot of right hemisphere activation, right, which is not happening as much in the normal reader. And on the left hemisphere, there's less activation. Oh, and I had that in there. There you go. So the question here in this study, which happened down in Houston, where I was before I came here, was, is this malleable? Can this be changed, sort of the activation of brain patterns for kids who are struggling to read? And so what happened here is they did a pre-intervention scan, a post-intervention scan to sort of see if the activation patterns changed. And what we see is that after we have a decreased activity in the right hemisphere and increased in the left. And so the brain is looking more like that typical reader that we saw in the beginning. Okay? So that's good news, right? So we can make change in young children in their brain in the way in which they are interacting with written text. We kind of already knew that behaviorally. So for 30 years, we've been doing studies of interventions and doing pre-post designs, and we're collecting all this data. We knew that behaviorally, but this study took it deeper because you're sort of looking at how the brain changes over time. Okay, so growth trajectories of struggling readers. So what you have here is a very basic line graph where if you just assess kids in first grade and then keep assessing them over time on reading development, sort of reading outcomes, you can see that over time, the kids who are struggling continue to struggle, and those who are not struggling in the beginning of first grade get better over time. And it also appears that that line between the kids who are struggling and those who aren't gets wider, the gap gets bigger and bigger. And this has been shown across many studies related to reading. And this is with just normal instruction, right? And this is true for lots of different assessments. So phonological awareness and letter knowledge, and also this one is letter knowledge. So basically what I'm showing here is that across time, across measures, that the gap between the lower performing kids and the higher performing kids gets worse over time if you do not intervene. So what happens if you do intervene? So this is from a study that we conducted in California when I was a doctoral student. And basically what we did is we screened a whole bunch of kids in first grade, and we followed them actually through, we have data on them through high school graduation now. And so the first line are the kids who were low risk. So we collected a bunch of data on them on first grade, and we said, this group of kids is not at risk for reading disabilities. They are going to be fine. And they did grow over time. The group on the bottom here were the high-risk kids. So over time, they improved a little bit in the early grades, which is actually really sort of normal. We sort of see a steep growth and then a flattening out. That's typical in the data as well. And then when you consider instruction and intervention, what happens? So I'm sorry this is sort of light, but the line that's a little bit above this group, the lowest group, they received just a research-based what we would call tier 1, so general education reading curriculum. And they got better, better than the kids who did not receive the research-based reading, tier 1 reading instruction. So they didn't receive any special instruction above and beyond what they got in their regular classroom setting. But the kids who got both, this next group, got both a tier 1 and research-based instruction from their gen ed teacher and then got supplemental intervention. They outperformed the other two lower performing groups, and they basically were performing at the same level as the kids who were not at risk in first grade. So this sort of shows you the power of well-planned and research-based interventions for kids with reading. So what are these evidence-based research practices? First, I just want to talk a little about what I mean when I'm talking about an evidence-based practice. So they're instructional strategies that are based in high-quality research. They've been tested on a range of students in multiple places, and they have measurable education, social, and behavioral benefit. And so these are the sort of studies that you think about, I think about as sort of the gold standard studies in education. So most of them are randomized treatment control studies where one kid gets the one thing and the other doesn't, and you compare their growth over time. And so you're really testing whether or not the intervention or the practice is what is making the change in the child, and it's not just typical development. So there's converging evidence from 3 reports now. I'm sure most people have heard of the National Reading Panel that came out in 2000, which when I say that now I think, oh my gosh, this is I feel sort of dated, because when I was a doctoral student, the National Reading Panel was the thing that had just come out. So, and then also the National Early Literacy Panel, which came out in 2008, and that sort of looked at what were the early predictors of later reading success. And then another book that came out even before the National Reading Panel, which was Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children. So the evidence-based practices that I'm going to talk about today come from these larger reports. So what does the literature tell us? So there's converging evidence that kids who are learning how to read and also those who are struggling with reading need explicit direct instruction in phonemic awareness, phonics, decoding and fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And I'm going to go into each of those with a little bit more depth, I think, as long as I have time. I do. Okay. So phonemic awareness, we've talked about this a couple times. It's the ability to manipulate sounds in words. So if I say to you, what are the sounds in the word cat? What do you say? K, a, t, right? Those are the sounds in the word cat. So children who are able to do that at an earlier age are less likely to have later reading difficulties, right? And so this is a trainable thing. This is a teachable thing. We can do phonemic awareness instruction with kids in classrooms pretty easily. And there are ways to make it fun and game-like. This really is one of the most compelling and well-established research findings, that phonemic awareness is really important in later reading decoding. So what do students need to learn? So they need to learn, I mean, I think some of this stuff you think, well, of course students know this, but they don't. If you sit down and have a conversation with a kid, they don't know that spoken words consist of individual sounds. A lot of students, if you sit down and talk to them, especially those who are struggling in phonological awareness, they have a hard time understanding that when I'm speaking to you in a sentence, that there are individual words in that sentence, right? So that's an even bigger, this is all very abstract to kids. So they need to know that words can be played with. We always talk about we're playing with words, so they can be segmented, they can be pulled apart, and they can be put back together. And they need to know how to use those skills to blend sounds that make up words, right? So how do we do this? We provide explicit and systematic instruction, focusing on developing phonological awareness over time. This is not something that you just sit down with them one time and do. This is a long process, especially for kids who are struggling with reading. And you want to make sure that they develop mastery of the easier skills before they get to the harder skills. There is an established developmental continuum of this, and if anyone's interested, I'm more than happy to send that your way. The other thing we know about phonological awareness instruction, and actually phonics and decoding, is that the effects of these interventions are actually better when kids are grouped together. Okay, so this is really important. I think also a resource issues for schools. One-on-one instruction is not more impactful than 1-on-3 or 1-on-4, right? It's not more better. Just if you leave with that, I'll be happy. It's not more better. And the reason is, the reason I, having sort of sat and watched done intervention myself, is that I really think kids learn from each other. They learn from each other's success, and they also learn from each other's mistakes, right? And so if you're correcting one child, every child is hearing that correction and they are learning, okay? And what's interesting is kids make unique mistakes, right? And so you want kids to have exposure to unique mistakes so that they're all learning different things. Okay, so phonics is really taking that phonological awareness and applying it to the written word. So this is often confusing, because when we move from phonemic awareness or phonological awareness to phonics, all we're basically saying is that we're using the sounds that we hear in oral language and applying it to written letters and words. And so you can really go very seamlessly from a phonemic awareness instruction to phonics pretty easily, and you can do it in the same lesson. Alphabetic awareness, we know, is important. There's one woman in particular who has spent her entire career sort of showing that alphabetic awareness is one of the most important things in later reading. And if you assess kids in the middle of kindergarten on just alphabetical knowledge. So awareness of the alphabet and the knowledge, the sounds and letters, you can predict who's going to be a better reader in 5th grade. It's a very powerful early screening tool. So phonics and word studies. So what do kids need to learn? They need to be able to accurately and rapidly identify letters of the alphabet. They need to know the alphabet principle, that these things that are very abstract to kids, so these things that we call letters that we understand because we're adults, that they have meaning, right? And they create meaning when you put them together. They need to understand that they connect back to the sounds that they hear, so very explicit instruction in that, and how to apply these skills when they're reading and writing. We want to make sure kids have a lot of practice in this, especially if you suspect that they have a dyslexic profile. Fluency. So fluency has been understudied empirically, mainly because it's hard to teach. It's really hard to teach. I see people nodding who may be trying to teach. How do I teach a kid to read faster, right? How do I do that? So fluency is the ability to read accurately at an appropriate rate with prosody and comprehension. So there's a lot packed in there. And so there are some teaching skills that I'm going to talk about in a little bit in a second. But the reason why fluency is really, really important is because if you think of the nature of reading, if you're looking at text and you're struggling to get through every word, so you're not fluently reading words, all of your cognitive resources are going to the reading part. And there's nothing left to think about what you're actually reading. And so when we look at large data sets of kids, and I've done this myself and a lot of my colleagues have, the correlation between reading fluency and reading comprehension is very, very high for that reason. If you're a fluent reader, you have the cognitive resources to pay attention to what you're reading and understand what you're reading. But if you're not a fluent reader, you just don't. It's really hard to pay attention to the comprehension piece while you're also sort of struggling over each word. So this is why fluency is so important. So automaticity, I often talk about reading, comparing it to driving a car from multiple levels. So we want to make sure that these processes are automatic. If you're teaching someone how to drive a car, what do you do? So do you just throw them in the car? No. So we have to explicitly teach all the different components, right? And one of them is fluency and automaticity. You want them to be fluent in using a brake. That's very important. You want them to be fluent in turning the wheel. And so all these skills have to be automatic and fluent. So we don't just throw text in front of kids and expect them to know how to read, right? That's sort of the comparison here. So for decoding and fluency, we have to explicitly teach a large proportion of our kids to decode words. This is sort of the sounding out of words. Those skills have to be taught for most of our kids. English is a very complex language, and it doesn't make sense a lot of the time. We want them to be able to automatically recognize words and also, over time, increase their speed and rate of reading. So how do we do this? So we want to provide them with opportunities for guided, oral, repeated reading, right? And we want to make sure that when we provide kids the opportunity to read text, that it's at their reading level. Because if it's not, they're going to struggle with the reading. And it also means that they're not developing their skills if they're struggling, right? Another thing that we have found effective in our interventions is that we will have a small group of kids in front of us, maybe 3 or 4, sometimes 2, and they will have a decodable text that's at the reading level of each of the kids, and 3 of the kids will be following along with their finger, and we call it sort of shadow reading or lip reading, so they're sounding them out, but they're not making the sound while the other student is doing the reading. So that's something that we have found to be effective. So vocabulary. Vocabulary is very important for understanding what you're reading. You have to know the meanings of the words to understand what you're reading. And this is also, I would say, a very understudied area in reading comprehension and sort of reading development, mainly because, like fluency, it's very hard to teach vocabulary. Because you have to make decisions about, well, which words do I teach? you can't teach every word, right? And so you have to make quick decisions about, okay, I'm going to elaborate on this word, but not this one. Kids need to know the meanings of most of the words in the text. Sometimes they can get through text knowing not as much, but if you really look at the studies that investigate word knowledge and comprehension, kids need to know around 85 to 90% of the words. They need to know the meaning of them in order to comprehend what they're reading. And they also need word learning strategies. So what do they do when they come upon a word that they don't know? That's something else that you can sort of explicitly teach. And I'm going to move quickly to comprehension. And I'm happy to engage with anybody about this more later if you want. So comprehension is not just the product of all of these other skills. Comprehension also has to be explicitly taught. And it should be taught from an early age. It should be taught from kindergarten on. It's not something that we should just wait till 3rd grade till kids are fluently reading and then expect them to know what they're reading. There's lots of different strategies that we use in our own research. There's been a few. The Institute of Educational Sciences recently, I think in 2013, put out a study guide that showed different strategies for reading comprehension instruction. And it included activating prior knowledge, setting a purpose for reading. This is another thing that I think a lot of people don't understand, that when you're with a child who is struggling with reading, they don't know why they're being asked to read. They don't know why they're reading. And so setting a purpose, say, well, I really want you to pay attention to this thing today. Or this is the question I want you to think about while you're reading. So it sets a purpose for them to get through the text. Good readers also monitor their understanding. So readers who have developed good reading skills, they know when they don't understand what they're reading, right? Kids who are struggling with reading, they don't know when they don't understand. And so teaching those skills of, well, do you understand what's going on? Why not? So how can we sort of having explicit instruction and understanding what they're reading and using strategies when they don't. We really like to encourage using both narrative and expository texts. And there's multiple reasons for this, but I've said this for a long time, when kids get to 3rd and 4th grade, they are expected to take out their science book and learn from that science book, and that is an expository text for the most part, right? And if we're only teaching narrative text in the early grades, then we're disadvantaging students later, because it's a different type of comprehension, so you have to be hitting on both the narrative and the expository text. Okay, so I'm bringing you back here only because, only to remind you that there are a lot of different things going on. And when you are assessing kids or working with kids individually, it's really important to know where are their strengths and where are their weaknesses, because you don't want to waste your time and your resources intervening on something that they don't need help in, right? You really want to target your intervention. And the other thing I want to say, which I say a lot to the tutors in the clinic, is that I think 50% of the battle here is really confidence. It's getting kids to feel successful. Human beings don't like to engage in things that's difficult for them. And I think we really need to think about that when we're working with these kids who year after year after year are struggling with reading. Because, if I'm not good at running, I'm not going to go running every day. I'm just going to make that decision that I'm not going to run. But the reading thing, the kids don't get to opt out of that, right? Because we want them all to read. So that's not an option for kids. So I say this only because I think it's important that we meet them at their level. And we really want kids, especially when we first start to work with them, to feel successful. And if that means backing up a bit, so I'm going to do something that I know you kind of already know already, but I need to develop this relationship with you that you're going to feel successful when you're with me, and then moving forward from there, I would highly encourage people to do that if they're working with kids who are struggling with reading, because I think more than 50% of this is really building confidence in kids who are reading, because they don't get to opt out, right? And they really probably want to, because they're feeling very frustrated. So where do you find evidence-based practices? So there are two pretty nice, new-ish online resources for this. So I want to make sure that everyone's aware. The first is the What Works Clearinghouse, and that's the Institute of Educational Sciences. They have a website where you can go in and you can say, well, I'm working with struggling readers. I want to look at what are the evidence-based practices for kids who are struggling in reading in elementary school, and they will pull up different studies that they've conducted on these different interventions, and they've sort of evaluated the studies that have been conducted. So it's like a secondary stamp of approval almost. It's not the researchers, so it wouldn't be me saying my intervention's amazing. It would be someone else independently evaluating that and saying, yes, we should use this. We can use this in school settings. And then the National Center for Intensive Intervention is a group that I sit on their technical working group, and they have a thing called tool charts. And they have gone a step beyond IES because they have evidence-based practices for intervention, but also for assessment. And currently, we are working on assessment for English language learners, because nobody's done that yet, sort of evaluating the assessments that are out there and whether or not they can be used to screen and identify kids who are English language learners and also appear to be struggling with reading. So that will be coming out hopefully soon. We're working on that we're working on it right now. So hopefully it will come out soon. But these are both really a good starting point if you're looking for these evidence-based practices for intervention and also assessment. Okay, that's all I have.
I have one question while people are filling out their question cards for the folks from CDE. When can people actually go to the CDE website to look at the guidelines, and if they have questions, is there a place that they can go to at CDE to ask?
Sure. So our goal is to have those guidelines published by mid-August, and we will also be doing some sort of a kickoff, so like a webinar, a rollout. In addition, you have our contact information and the PowerPoint. Richard and I are it. So if you have questions, you've got our email and our phone number. You can contact us directly. You can go through an email called dyslexia@cde.ca.gov, but it's just easier to go directly to us because that goes to us too. But I'm better about reading my personal email than the dyslexia email, so.
How much intervention was needed per weekday to make the dramatic change?
So that this is like years ago now. And there's been many interventions since. That one was 4 days a week for 30 to 40 minutes in small group settings. But it was very sort of efficient. The lessons were very structured.
How can pediatricians help identify kids with or at risk for reading difficulty in such as pre-K well check?
Pediatricians? Mm-hmm. I guess this is mine too. So this is an interesting question because when I worked at University of Texas, I worked in the medical school and I was a developmental pediatrics. I was a professor of developmental pediatrics. I never thought I'd end up there. And we worked together to develop this because pediatricians don't learn about this in medical school, right? And so that's actually, most pediatricians are not trained on how to identify dyslexia. And the person who you should be going to is your pre-K or K teacher because they know more. But there are programs in place. There are some pediatricians do use screening measures for different things like autism and also language difficulties. But there's nothing sort of systematic in place that I know of in California. Maybe you know better than me.
No, but I'll just share, in California we have a sort of a conundrum in the field of special education, and you can raise your hand if you've ever heard this before. You go to a school, this happened to me, you go to a school, you say, I think my child has dyslexia, and the person that you're talking to either says dyslexia is not real, or says dyslexia is a medical condition and we don't assess for medical conditions, okay? So it's just the most bizarre conundrum. At this point, what has happened as a result of the AB 1369 legislation is dyslexia was not added as a category under specific learning disability, but phonological processing was added under one or more psychological processes that qualifies a student for dyslexia. So You may not get the pediatrician note, and you don't really need it anymore, because what you can do is point to ed code that says, yeah, I know dyslexia is not right there, but it says phonological processing, and dyslexia is a problem with phonological processing. So a very weird conundrum, but it is in ed code now.
Can you talk about different intervention tools used at the middle school level, because the social emotional capital required is different?
So I can give, I don't know who asked that question, but there's a group of researchers in Texas who are looking at this actually, and it's Sharon Vaughn and her colleagues. And they have a few papers out now sort of looking at how to work with kids who are dyslexic in secondary settings and working through science classes. So how do you sort of work in the content areas with kids, and also they also provided supplemental instruction on decoding and fluency on top of sort of the secondary content area courses. So if you want to email me, I can give you those resources.
Okay, what about dyslexia related to orthographic processing? Do you have strategies to improve that?
So the strategies that you're going to use for orthographic processing are going to be pretty similar to the ones you're using for kids who have phonological processing difficulties. And when you think about orthographic processing, you're sort of talking about the letter connection. So when I talk about phonological awareness, that's really the first step, right? And once kids develop a good phonological awareness base, then you move it into the orthographic stuff and the writing and the fluent, all the other stuff. So it sort of builds over time in that way. And when we're working with kids in our clinic, we're doing both at the same time. So we're doing the phonological processing, we're doing orthographic stuff, and maybe we're using the same words, but doing it in these sort of different modalities with orthography and also orally. So I think it all ties together.
Since the AB 1369 guidelines are not binding to the LEA, how do we encourage them to implement them in schools?
Yeah, well, that's the $6 million question. I'll tell you one thing you could say. Right now, there's a very large urban school district in California that is facing a class action lawsuit exactly around this issue. So the key is, I think, using your powers of persuasion to convince your leaders that it's the right thing to do, and the earlier you do it, the better. And you can point to Emily's research, you can point to the research coming out of UCSF, that the earlier the intervention occurs, the better the outcomes.
And the next one kind of dovetails that one. How do you see the new dyslexia law being implemented in schools for both assessment, identification, and intervention services?
So talking is that question specifically about like a student that would qualify for an IEP? No real clarity there. So here's the interesting, again, sort of conundrum. A student with dyslexia may or may not qualify for an IEP. There's a slide in there where I show like the number of students that have a specific learning disability. Depending on the assessment processes that a district uses to qualify students for an SL, a specific learning disability, he or she may not qualify for an IEP. My opinion, just my opinion, and Richard can weigh in, that's okay as long as they get the intervention that they need. In reality, you can do it several different ways, and I think, like Emily said, I think the best model, especially for older kids, is they get some push-in help, so they're not pulled out of their core instruction, but then they also get supplemental targeted help, if a district can structure it that way. But the key there being, they don't have to have an IEP. Even without an IEP, even if the school says they don't qualify for an IEP, if they're a struggling reader, they're still entitled to instruction and support to help them grow. I know that's a tricky part, but.
And I would just add that it's certainly CDE's message around providing support for students is that, and if you saw Kristen Wright's talk earlier, it's that we want to provide support to the whole child, and we want to get away from this idea that special ed students are over here and general education students are over here, and the way we're going to provide support to them is somehow divided. That's when you implement a MTSS system. We want to get away from that idea of a kid with an IEP can only be served by a special education service provider, or that a kid without an IEP can't be receive support. So really the issue is the student a struggling reader? And then yes, we can see they are struggling whether they have an IEP or not. Then what are the supports that that the school has put in place to help that kid, whether they have an IEP or not? And we really want to break down those walls that have kind of been in place for a long time.
Richard, I have a couple more questions, but before that, I just wanted to sort of piggyback a comment or a question on what you just said. And that's that there are districts that are in different places in terms of MTSS, in terms of the training that they've done for teachers, and you know, the process of getting everyone up to speed is going to take some time. And at the MTSS conference, did they give you guys any sense of how long from the time a commitment is made to really make that shift until you actually reach full implementation for those who maybe live in districts that aren't quite there yet?
It varies, just depending on, they've got, the SWIFT Center is working with 5 states in the United States to implement this in a fully integrated way. They've got 5 years of data, and even with 5 years of implementation, different districts in different states are somewhere along a continuum. The good news is when they broke down their data and did the research study, even at a 41% level of implementation of this multi-tiered system around instructional support, even at a 41%, so less than 50% full implementation, you will still see very positive outcomes in student achievements, and what they measured was reading. So they looked at reading outcomes in schools that were even just at a 41% level of implementation. The other thing I can offer is, as my director, Kristen Wright, she tells me sometimes, she said, Theresa, you know how to speak the language of districts. I've been a superintendent, I've been a site administrator, I've kind of done all the jobs. I never drove the bus because I couldn't reach the pedals. But they tried to get me special shoes, but I said no, okay? We are available to go out and speak and share these presentations with superintendents at the SUPS Council, at the County Office of Ed. We're getting more and more connections with the County Office of Ed, with SESSA, with these different organizations, with AXA. We can come to your district and craft a presentation for the audience that needs to hear this message. We're getting it out, but you can drop little bugs in people's ears as well. We have been invited to many SELPA meetings. We've been invited in Placer County. We spoke to their curriculum instruction group. We've gone to 3 SELPA meetings. We'll be back in Orange County next month, and I think the following month we'll probably be down in San Diego. So word is getting out, but if your administrative staff hasn't heard about it yet, let us come. We'll talk. I've done high school administration, so I know how to speak secondary language as well.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.